Mr. Sinister. When Charles Darwin did his groundbreaking research into the nature of human evolution, he had hoped to uncover the mysteries of how life worked. But his protege, Nathaniel Essex, was to use this knowledge to obtain power and shape the destiny of the human race. He made a deal with the evil apocalypse, gaining near immortality and complete control over his physiology, and ruthlessly pursued his goal of shaping life to his own twisted ends. The year was 1859, and scientist Nathaniel Essex had read a new book by Charles Darwin entitled On the Origin of Species. Although greatly inspired by Darwin's theory of evolution, Essex felt that mankind would evolve much faster than theorized, and that Darwin was held back by morality. Desperate to prove his theories, he started carrying out questionable experiments involving human and animal cadavers, and even dug up the body of his own dead son in his hunt for the mutant gene, or what he called the Essex factor. Needing fresher test subjects, Essex employed a group of thugs he called the Marauders to kidnap the poor and homeless. Whilst out collecting specimens for Essex, they happened upon a powerful being named Sabretooth, or Apocalypse for short, who demanded to meet their leader. Apocalypse found Essex experiments fascinating and saw a chance to make a powerful new ally. So he offered Essex a prolonged life and limitless power in return for absolute loyalty. This evil alliance was too much for Essex's pregnant wife, and as she slipped into death, she damned her husband with the last word she uttered: Sinister. It was then that Jean Grey and Scott Summers, two mutants from the future who had travelled through time to stop the rise of Apocalypse, appeared and begged Essex not to go through with it. But with nothing left in his life except his science, Essex ignored them and entered the transformation chamber of Apocalypse. When he stepped out, Essex was changed in every way. He had a pasty white complexion. He was now immortal, and the process had even changed his outfit into a nice tasseled blue affair, complete with a red diamond on his forehead. With Essex essentially dead, he needed a new name, and remembering the last thing his wife said to him, he decided on the unmistakable Sinister. Sinister also came through the transformation with clarity of purpose, and he soon realized that if he obeyed Apocalypse implicitly, he was going against everything he believed in. Apocalypse wanted Sinister to create a plague to destroy mankind, but Sinister believed that cruelty without purpose was ignorance, and that was the enemy of science. With that in mind, he created the plague, but designed it to attack Apocalypse. Weakened, Apocalypse went into hiding to recover. Knowing that one day Apocalypse would come back for him, Sinister spent the next century moving around the world, carrying out research and committing crimes against humanity. In 1891, he met a pair of time-travelling mutants, Gambit and Courier, and cut a deal with them that allowed him to clone Courier's shape-shifting power. This was the first time Sinister realized he could replicate others' powers in himself. A few years later, he encountered Grigory Rasputin, the mad monk, and recognizing the Essex factor in him, did a deal with him. Sinister could inject mutant genes into the many women that Grigory impregnated, in the hopes of making genetically superior offspring. Medical ethics, anyone? Just before the end of the 19th century, Sinister happened upon a man named Daniel Summers, who was chock full of the Essex factor. What Sinister didn't know was that Daniel was a former guinea pig of pre-Sinister Nathaniel Essex. Known only as Daniel, he'd taken the surname of his rescuers, the time-travelling Scott Summers and Jean Grey. Little did Sinister know that this encounter would be the beginning of his future obsession with the Summers family. In the 1920s, he worked side by side with Edgar Wyndham, who would later become the High Evolutionary. And in the 1940s, he worked with the Nazis in Auschwitz. It was here he earned the nickname Nosferatu, because of his pale complexion and bloodthirsty ways. Even the Nazis were terrified of him. During his tenure there, he made a clone of Namor that he named N2. It was also around this time that he met John Greycrow, who would later become Scalp Hunter, the first of Sinister's new marauders. As time went on, he continued his experiments, mainly on mutant babies, but in the 60s, rumours spread of a white devil in Saigon who was kidnapping soldiers and villagers. Skip forward a few decades, and at long last, the name of Mr. Sinister reached the X-Men. Hearing of the sewer-dwelling mutants known as Morlocks, Sinister discovered that they were the result of experiments by Dark Beast, a beast from another reality. It turned out that Dark Beast had been taught by his reality Sinister, and that he used similar methods to his tutor. Hoping to prevent further unauthorized use of his techniques, Sinister got Gambit to recruit for him a new team of marauders in order to clear an old debt. He then ordered those marauders to head into the sewers and wipe out every last one of the Morlocks, which they did with great relish, and before any of the X-Men could get there to stop him, thus proving that the good guys don't always win. After nearly wiping out an entire species, Sinister turned to his latest obsession, the Summers family. Seeing Cyclops and Jean Grey as two of the best specimens of mutant kind around, Sinister was virtually salivating at the thought of the two of them one day having a baby that could be used in a fight against Apocalypse. But the prospect of Scott and Jean procreating became less likely when Jean became Phoenix, crazy, and then dead. Still, Sinister wasn't one to let a little thing like death get in the way of him having a super mutant baby to work on. So he simply made a clone of Jean Grey, called Madeline Pryor, who Cyclops soon fell in love with and married. Not long after, she fell pregnant and gave birth to a bouncing baby boy. Everything was good, right? Wrong. After Scott left her for the resurrected Jean Grey, and Sinister revealed her true origins to her, Madeline had a little bit of a breakdown, which, thanks to a certain interfering demon, turned her into the scantily clad and abundantly evil Goblin Queen. The X-Men finished her off soon enough, but they blamed Sinister for everything, and with one powerful optic blast from Cyclops, the villain was seemingly destroyed. But of course, he was soon back. It turned out he'd used his powers to make it look like he'd been destroyed, thus giving himself a chance to escape and regroup. Unluckily for him, though, it was only a matter of time before his previous exploits, involving the Summers, came back to bite him on the behind. To cut a very long story short, Apocalypse infected Cyclops' son with a techno-organic virus, so he was sent into the future, 2,000 years, to be cured. When he came back, he was the adult hero, Cable. Unfortunately, his evil clone, Strife, came back as well. Convinced that he was the real deal, and Cable was the copy, Strife went after the parents, Scott and Jean, after they had abandoned him. Strife cut a deal with Sinister. He would give him 2,000 years' worth of Summers DNA, in exchange for Sinister giving Strife his parents. Well, Sinister could hardly contain himself at the thought of all that juicy DNA, So he came up with a plan to disguise himself as Apocalypse and get the Big A's followers to kidnap the pair. Actually worked, for a while anyway, until Cable turned up and ruined everything by destroying Strife. Still, at least Sinister had got his hands on the canister of Summer's DNA. But on opening that canister, Sinister found that there was no DNA inside. He had been tricked by Strife, and that was not the worst of it. You see, when he opened the container, he actually released an airborne plague known as the Legacy virus that targeted mutants. Realizing the seriousness of what he'd done, and also realizing that if all the mutants died, he wouldn't have anyone to experiment on, Sinister went straight to Cyclops and told him everything. He even offered to help find a cure. It was actually scientific genius Hank McCoy who discovered a way to cure it some years later. The sinister obsession with the Summers family reared its head again soon after, but this time he was interested in Cable, who he saw as the tool with which he could rid himself of Apocalypse. On occasion he'd appear before Cable and tell him all about how he'd engineered his birth and how it was inevitable that Apocalypse and Cable would one day fight, and that maybe he should let Sinister juice him up a little. Cable refused his help, but when the time came, he still managed to vanquish Apocalypse, with a little help from the X-Men, of course. With his former master destroyed, Sinister was now completely free to carry out his work as he'd always wanted. And with that in mind, he signed up to work on the Weapon X program, disguised as Dr. Robert Windsor, one of the scientists working at the mutant concentration camp known as Neverland. Still in disguise, he started helping the mutants to escape, but in reality, he was taking them from one hell to another, his private labs where he conducted his own twisted experiments on them. At about this time, Sabretooth was approached by a mysterious corporation called Megacorp, which wanted to see Sinister dead. Sabretooth snuck into Sinister's castle, but before they could fight, the head of Megacorp arrived and revealed himself to be Dr. John Sublime, the man behind the Weapon Plus program. He also happened to be a sentient bacteria in a human host. Despite paying Sabretooth to kill him, Sublime was actually a huge fan of Sinister's work, and really just wanted him found so he could acquire the super mutants for his own plan. Sinister was more than happy to oblige, as he saw them as absolute failures. Sinister then took his weird science to an international level when he went to Russia and started killing the descendants of one of his previous subjects, the mad monk Grigory Rasputin. On Rasputin's deathbed, he performed a ritual that passed his essence into Grigory's pregnant wives, and promised that he would return when only one of his descendants remained. One of these descendants turned out to be the X-Man, Colossus. After hearing of the murders, he travelled back to Russia to protect his one remaining cousin, Larissa. Upon arriving, he soon discovered that Sinister was in league with his own brother, Mikhail, and that he was the Rasputin that Sinister intended for Grigory to be reborn in. After Sinister killed Larissa, only Colossus and Mad Mikhail remained. Breaking the hold Sinister had over him, Mikhail foiled his evil machinations by exiling himself to another dimension from which he could never return. After M-Day, when the Scarlet Witch recreated the world with 3 simple words, "No more mutants," the mutant race was left in dire straits. With less than 200 mutants remaining in the world, extinction seemed inevitable. Beast was feverishly trying to find a way to reverse the disaster, and in desperation, turned to the world's most brilliant criminal scientists, including a certain Mr. Sinister. But Sinister wasn't interested. It turned out he had his own plans for the future of mutant kind, and all he needed were the Destiny Diaries. These diaries contained a detailed list of the future events that were to follow the recent decimation of mutant kind, and were a key part of Sinister's mysterious plot. Discovering their location, he sent his new marauders after the diaries. Unfortunately, Gambit destroyed them accidentally. This was a serious setback for Sinister, but at the same time there was a new development which piqued Sinister's interest. In Alaska, a baby was born, but not just any baby. It was the first mutant baby since M-Day. Sinister sent his marauders to bring him the child, but they weren't alone. The X-Men were also on their way, along with the Purifiers, a religious sect who were carrying on William Stryker's work in the field of mutant genocide. The race was on, and despite Cable getting to the baby first, the Marauders eventually got their hands on a pint-sized mutant messiah. Sinister, however, would never get the opportunity to run all those tests to ensure he had lined up for the poor child. Displeased about his inability to rid Rogue's psyche of the 8,000 minds she had recently absorbed, Mystique killed him. Of course, Sinister has made more comebacks than an aging rock band. Each time he's died, he has retreated back into the lab and continued his research, free from the morality and influence of all the do-gooders in the outside world. It's really this ability to tinker with humanity and mutant kind from behind the scenes that makes Nathaniel Essex truly sinister.